Welcome back to the Ohio MMA Podcast. I'm your host, David McKinney, and joining me today for the first time, as you've hear his famous dog in the background, is Hunter Homistek, the general manager of 247 Fighting Championships, which makes their debut in Ohio this weekend at the Sharonville Convention Center with 513 Fight Night. So thanks for joining me, Hunter. How you doing?
For sure, man. I'm doing super great. As you mentioned, Babs is already making herself well known there in the background, so that's always a good time. I think it's about mail time around here, so that could have been the mailman
Oh.
dropping off some mail. She just can't handle it. Can't handle the heat.
Yeah, my dog every morning, you can't see I'm actually in my office, and behind me is like it's our guest room too, and she lays on the bed and looks out the window. So I get alerted of any nefarious activity going on in the streets out there. So
That's perfect. That's perfect. Hey, they're the best, man. She obviously she does make a lot of noise, but I'm glad it's better with her around. When she's like a doggy daycare or something, or we're on vacation, it's like, man, it's not the same without a little chaos in the house. Like
I
we kind of
know.
need it now.
Yeah. So yeah, but thanks for joining me. I know this weekend making the debut at Sharonville Convention Center. Of course, I don't know, Ohio fight fans are probably fairly familiar with 247 FC. I've been to a bunch of the shows. I've actually done commentary for a bunch of the shows. You guys are based out of Pittsburgh, making your way over to Ohio. So just talk quickly kind of what the thought process was in coming to Ohio and I guess Cincinnati specifically.
For sure, man. So our owner promoter Ryan Middleton, this is his baby, this is his creation. He started this back in April 2019. So that was the first 247 Fighting Championship show in Pittsburgh, and then I joined around Brawlenberg 8, which would have been August 2021, I believe. So there was a period there that I can't speak to too much, but just from talking to Ryan so much, obviously, we've been working extremely closely for the past 2 years now, and his vision was always this. He wrote a business plan when he very first started 247, and this kind of expansion was always part of the plans. And obviously, COVID put a huge monkey wrench into that, or it may have already happened by now. But to answer your question about why Ohio, why Cincinnati specifically, when we look at places to expand to, the first things that we try to check are, where are fighters coming from to fight for us? Like, where are out of town fighters coming from? Because if there's a central location that fighters are leaving home to fight elsewhere, that tells us that there must not be a strong local MMA promotion presence there. Otherwise, they would just stay home and fight. Um, like you see that in Pittsburgh or Columbus, or especially New England. They have very strong like Cage Titans and New England fights up there. New England fighters rarely leave New England because they don't have to. So we saw Cincinnati fighters constantly traveling, and we knew vision was there. And I know Ryan and I both talked to you to kind of get a better feel of the landscape there. There's Drive MMA, there's Vision, there's Club MMA, there's gyms there, but they all have to travel for fights. So we were like, okay, so why not Cincinnati? And the more we looked into it, we took a couple trips to Cincinnati, talked to several gym owners, fighters, et cetera, et cetera. And it just felt like the right place. It felt like the opportunity was there in terms of the quality of fighters, the quality of gyms, the quality of venues. There was a lot of appeal to Cincinnati for sure. And with the infrastructure that was there, but untapped. I mean, the last event in Cincinnati, as far as we could find, and there may have been one or two in between, but it was that UFC Fight Night card way back in 2014, Matt Brown versus Eric Silva. So that's how far of a throwback that is
Yeah.
for any MMA fans. Probably remember that fight card well, but I mean, we're talking literally 9 years ago. So that's a long stretch of time when you consider 247 has only been around for 4 years total, and it feels like we've been grinding on this thing forever. So double that and then add a year, and that's how long it's been since Cincinnati's had an event. So it was time, man. And I'm very, very, very pleased with the card we put together. A lot of the things that we thought in terms of the talent and the matchups that were available and things like that definitely came to fruition. I think you can see it when you look at the card.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. I was looking through the card and I was actually kind of did a little bit of research and because I was going to call you out if that wasn't true that there was an event because I saw you guys talked about that on your podcast, but there hasn't been one in the Cincinnati area. We've had a few in Northern Kentucky. And I was actually looking through the card, and some of the guys have never really even had a local fight. So Ilyas, who's the main
Wow.
event, he's fought in Northern Kentucky a couple times. Same with Zach Kamara. They fought in Northern Kentucky, but it still is that little difference of just having to go over the river. Like I live in Cincinnati, and Northern Kentucky is part of Cincinnati, but it's different when it's in Cincinnati and Ohio. And the interesting thing, and we'll talk about the card and the makeup of the card and some more of the fighters, but um, there's 4 pro fights on this card, and it's interesting. I know you guys mentioned that you had actually a little bit of trouble, getting amateurs because they can just go to Kentucky, and the rules are a little different in Kentucky. They can throw head kicks. Some promoters even let them throw elbows. I don't know how many do that anymore, but they can. And the big thing is they can weigh in the day before. And it's interesting, kind of coming from PA, where for some of the guys, the novice amateur rules are a little bit of a hindrance as well. Not to get too deep into like the politics and things like that, because I know that there are some changes I think coming in Ohio, but it is interesting that you guys I know talked with Chuck Haskell, who's the new executive director, and he comes from a promoter background, and I think maybe that he can kind of see like, hey, you guys get that feedback of like it's been tough to get amateurs on this card and grow this sport, because they say, hey, if I'm in Cincinnati, why wouldn't I just go to Kentucky and fight fight the and get day before weigh-ins? And I know Pittsburgh, the law, you and I but have both been around long enough that it was kind of the opposite before, where amateur MMA really essentially wasn't even legal in PA for the longest time. And then still now the novice rules. I'm not the biggest fan of the novice rules, but I see the reasoning why you want to get the 2-minute rounds, use the shin guards, no striking to the head. I see why, especially for people who want to dip their toes into the sport. But then in the Pittsburgh area, you guys have guys that are coming in and just national champion wrestlers, and they're still like, well, you got to go through novice, and it doesn't. It's sometimes it doesn't really make sense. But do you guys get a little bit of that in Pittsburgh still, like the guys not wanting to fight there, and now you're kind of dealing with it a little bit, kind of the opposite in Ohio?
It's funny, man. We definitely thought, because we've heard from gyms in Pittsburgh and Pennsylvania in general, that they'll go to Ohio to fight because they allow amateurs, specifically because they allow ground and pound on the ground for all levels of amateurs. And as you're talking there, Dave, just for anybody listening who isn't familiar, in in Pennsylvania, in novice amateur, that's 3 fights or less, or more than 3 fights with a losing record, but typically just 3 fights or less amateurs. Once you secure a takedown, you can't ground and pound to the head. There's no ground and pound to the head allowed. Ohio, it is allowed. So it's funny because we thought it would be way easier now. Okay, Ohio allows ground and pound to the head. Everybody's going to like that, but they have same day weigh-ins, and that became the new hurdle. So it was like there's always something with amateurs. It can't just ever be super easy and super convenient for everybody. But I think it's really interesting, and I know I've pointed this out before, but I always thought it was interesting. You get a guy like Lucas Siebert, who I'm sure your audience is familiar with, kind of an Ohio and Pittsburgh guy now, currently living in Pittsburgh, but from
And West
Columbus
Virginia guy.
and West Virginia. Yeah, he's the tri-state king. But he came in as a D1 college wrestler, amateur MMA debut for us in Pennsylvania, and specifically wanted Pennsylvania because he wasn't allowed to ground and pound. And I thought that was super interesting because for a wrestler, that's obviously your quickest path to victory is going to be, especially at that level, probably dominate with your takedown, get them down, and just pound them out, get a TKO. He didn't want to be able to do that because he thought that would literally be too easy for him. So he's like, give me a rule set that forces me to strike more, forces me to work on my submissions and submission defense more, instead of just taking the easy way out. So I really respected that. I thought that was cool on his part to view it as a
Interesting.
positive and not a negative, as a learning experience for him. And look at him now, 5-0, multi promotion champ, and definitely has a very, very promising MMA career in development. So that worked for him. In Ohio, though, like you were saying about the amateurs, it was a little more difficult, but we do have a good amateur card. But I think what stood out even more of that was just the pro scene in Ohio and the Cincinnati region. There is a much, much, much more robust pro scene in Ohio than in Pennsylvania. For some of our cards in Pennsylvania, we'll have 1 or 2 pro fights and then like 10 amateur fights, and that's the card. And it's a really good card. The audience loves it, and I love it too. I love watching the amateurs progress through the ranks and kind of identifying these guys who will take that jump to pro and just watch their careers develop. It's really rewarding. But for Cincinnati, it was just interesting because there were so many pros available. We're not used to having this kind of, widespread of pros available to us. I mean, we have 4 pro fights on the card, and honestly could have had 7 or 8 if everything would have fallen together well. Like if we had matched every single fighter available to us, we could have had 7 or 8 pro fights, like almost, an LFA or UFC level card, like a small UFC card with
Yeah.
8 pros. It would be crazy. That is just simply not available for us in Pittsburgh. So that was definitely a learning experience for us too.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was thinking about that because you mentioned I heard you mention that, and I think that the sport in Ohio is maybe just a couple of years ahead of Pennsylvania. Like you guys have a lot of guys that are on the cusp of turning pro or have 4, 5, 6 fights, and you're like, hey, in a couple of years or in a year or so, this guy will be pro. Ohio is probably just slightly ahead of that. Like we've had a lot of those fighters, and a lot of guys stayed really active during COVID too. There actually were a handful of events here that guys could stay active, and in PA, I know that there really weren't a lot. And in Ohio, it seems like the other thing too is Western Pennsylvania is so much different than Eastern Pennsylvania, and Western Pennsylvania has one promotion now. Really, I know that there were a couple before, a couple really good ones, and you and I have been to a lot of those events, and then it kind of stopped, and then 247 really filled that void. In Ohio, it seems like we've always had like a good number of events, and fighters are slightly willing. There's still regions like there's the Columbus region, there's the Cleveland, Akron area, and then Cincinnati. Everyone has always traveled, so it will be interesting to see kind of what the crowd is like um, in Sharonville Convention Center this Saturday. So let's talk a little bit about the fight card. You mentioned LFA. I actually was at the LFA 160 event in Kentucky a couple of months ago, and 2 of the fighters that are on the card for this 247 event actually fought and put on impressive performances on that card. So you mentioned LFA level of event, and neither one of them are actually the main event. So let's start out. I was looking through the card. Um, and the matchups. I mean, I do a lot of research. I'm doing commentary for the fight card, so I guess um, just to let everybody know uh, on 247fighting.com. But when I watch a lot of these guys, and I've seen most of them fight live, but I'll go back and kind of look and like pick a couple of things. The matchups are really interesting, and I think that the fact that you guys have a guy in Jim Mooney who really is a fight fan. Like when I hear Jim talk about fights, I'm like, oh man, this dude really loves fights and he knows what he's talking about. He's not just like trying to throw 2 fights together, 2 guys together who are the same weight or 2 girls.
Yep.
But the main event I think is the really one. I assume it's the main event. Ilyas Mamadaliev and Will Worley. And Will's an interesting guy because he's from Virginia, but this is actually his 3rd pro fight in Ohio. He's like, I guess, kind of an honorary Ohio guy.
Yep.
But two strikers, and 2. It's interesting coming into Ohio, like a wrestling state, just like Pennsylvania. 2 guys with a striking background. That's a really interesting fight, and 2 fighters that the loser will be 500. And so this is a really pivotal fight for both of those guys. Um, and I think it's really interesting to see it because I think one of the winner probably could get to that next step up, get an LFA fight, get a really big regional fight. That's an interesting fight. And Ilyas is a guy who he really promotes himself well, carries himself well, training out of Vision, which I know Joey Patterson, Jeremy Pinder. They are kind of the 2 of the best known names, best coaches in the area, and to see them buy into 247 early on was kind of interesting. I think that you guys probably are really grateful for that because that definitely helps when one of the biggest gyms with the most fighters buys into to your event.
No doubt, man. I mean, you said it perfectly there towards the end. I mean, we said it on one of our podcasts as well recently. It was just having that support from Vision was so huge. I mean, there's several Vision fighters on this card, and we literally couldn't have had a card without them. So the fact that they trusted in us and not only helped fill the card, but filled the card with very interesting, high quality fighters and high quality matchups, and were easy to work with, super professional with everything in their paperwork. I mean, any promoter, any regional promotion knows how big that is, to just have gyms that are on top of things and on top of their paperwork and buttoned up and understand the process. So without them, maybe there is no 513 fight night, honestly. So the making that the main event was kind of a no-brainer for us for a lot of things that you said. Ilyas's local appeal, his strong presence, his fighting style. He's also had a string of like the most unlucky situations ever in his career. He's had like 5 or 6 canceled fights in the past year and a half, which is just pretty unheard of. That's just kind of one of those things that you wonder, if none of that happened, would he already be at that next level? Like how much did that really delay his career growth? So I thought it was important and very like necessary to give him a high profile bout, because those things were outside of his control. I didn't want him to feel like his career was punished because of things that were outside of his control. So
He he was on a couple of, fight cards where the entire event got canceled, which
yeah,
is even worse than just, I mean, your own fight. It's every fight on the card got canceled. So that's a really bad
yeah.
string of luck.
Yeah, dude. I mean, you're putting in a full fight camp, you're promoting your fight, you're working hard, you're studying film, and then the promoter cancels the event. I mean, there's literally nothing a fighter can do about that, and no warning they would be given that that's going to happen. And I'm sure the fallout was terrible. So, yeah, I mean, having him as the main event against Worley, like you said, a very, very talented fighter coming off a knockout victory in bare knuckle fighting of all things. So, dude's clearly got knockout power and got hands and is a very real threat to upset Ilyas in that main event. I mean, it's kind of funny because we do our research, we watch YouTube videos as much as we can, talk to the coaches as much as we can. But the bottom line is that, in full honesty, we don't know these Ohio fighters nearly like we know our Pittsburgh fighters at this point. Like when we put together a card in Pittsburgh, we have a very, very strong feeling of how the fight can go, how the matchup's going to be, how they're going to square up with each other. And of course, in MMA, anything can happen at any time, and it doesn't always go how you think. I mean, that's just a given. But we have a very good idea of like, okay, this guy should have an advantage here. This guy should have an advantage here. So it's a very fair matchup. And I'm also glad that you gave credit to Jim Mooney, because that's a very, very good point, and I appreciate you recognizing that he doesn't just take amateur 170, amateur 170, okay, fight. He literally looks at their backgrounds, their records, any common opponents, what kind of opponents did you beat? Because you know this as well as anybody, but for the listeners who maybe are just getting into regional MMA, just because you're like a 2-0, 3-0 amateur, there could be a 1-4 amateur out there that would just absolutely wreck you. That's just taking extremely high level fights. So we always look at wins, of course, but I think looking at losses is even more important. Who did you lose to? If you lost
Yeah.
to guys, we see amateurs all the time who are like 1-3, but they've lost to guys who are all currently like in the LFA or on contender series, like just turned into these really high level pros. And it's like, okay, nobody knew at the time that guy would be that, but it turns out that's just really unfortunate that
Yeah.
that's who you had to fight then. So there's a lot to consider with that. So in Ohio, we're coming in a little less informed on that level, but overall, man, still extremely, extremely proud of the card we put together, and think it's going to be an absolute banger.
Yeah, I wanted to run through a couple of the other fights. Well, the co-main event I know is a heavyweight fight, but the fight that my pick to steal the show is Zach Kamara, Frenchie, also from Vision, against Sean Rawl. And Kamara, when you look at the records, it's like 2-2 versus 4-9, but Kamara has 2 wins. He has a both of the guys he's beat were undefeated, 2-0 and a 4-0 guy, and he beat Dalton Goins, who just beat Donnie Blue in Kentucky, and his losses are against Abbas Abbasov, who's like a world level judoka and one of the best. Like he'll be in the UFC probably in the next 12 months, and Malcolm Wellmaker, who was 3-0 at the time. So you see 2-2, and then it's like, okay, well, who did he fight? That's always a huge thing. Is like he's taking really tough fights, and he was 6-0 as an amateur, and had wins over a guy like Seth Schaefer, who's now making noise on the bare knuckle scene. And then Sean Raw. Sean is one of my favorite guys to watch. He's has a bunch of, I think he's like 9 boxing fights, but his ground game, his grappling game is so slick, and it's like he gets in these like kind of like he looks like he's in a bad position, and then it's like, oh, he just triangled a dude, and he's he has a really slick ground game, and
Yeah.
really really fun to watch, and also just a really good striker. He's been around for a long time, and I know he trains at he's from the Cleveland area, trains at a boxing gym, but he does a little bit of work with like Devontae Smith when he's in town. I know he trains with Rail Hodge every once in a while. But that's a really interesting fight too. Um, like I said, that's my pick to steal the show. And they're both, I think, natural like 35ers, but they're coming up to 45. So it's like, hey, they both are going to be, you know, kind of evenly matched in terms of weight, but they are not going to be like as sucked out as like
Yep.
if they had to cut, that 10 extra pounds to get down to 135. So that's my pick to steal the show.
I think that's a awesome pick. I know Jim and I had talked about that as well, and that was both of our independently without even discussing it. We both thought that would be the fight of the night as well, just in terms of the matchup for all the reasons you said. I mean, they're both extremely dangerous everywhere. But that level of pro too, when you're just that well-rounded skill set, there's nowhere that fight can go that one guy is going to be completely lost or completely overwhelmed. I mean, they're going to put on a really good fight. And Zachariah was a guy who Patterson was telling us, like, you guys really want Zach on the card. Just trust me on this one. Like, match Zach, get him on the card. So I'm like,
Yeah.
all right, like I said, we needed a lot of that information. We needed to just trust people, take their advice, ask them, like, hey, who are fighters from your gym that you think are very exciting or very skilled or underrated, things like that. Like, who should we get? And Zach was consistently one of the guys that they were saying, listen, you want him on your card. And then when we found Sean Raw, it's like, holy crap, this is a dream come true because both of them are just bringing heat.
Yeah. Yeah. Zach has a little bit of, and I'm probably going to get in trouble for saying this, but a little bit of Kama Worthy in him. Very similar
Ooh,
fighting style, long, lanky guy. Not like the same type of like. I mean, Kama, if he never had to grapple again a day in his life, which I think he probably won't, but he's a Kama Worthy, but a little bit similar striking, kind of that unorthodox style. But then also I think he's a judo brown belt and a jiu-jitsu purple belt at just really slick ground game. So let's talk about the two LFA vets on the card. So Cam Kenzik, who comes from Columbus, and Immortal, Matt Brown, Mark Holman. That team. He's 3-0
yep.
with 3 finishes, including at LFA 160, fighting Raiden Kovacs. Which you look at 3-0 against 0-1, but Raiden was a high level amateur who I called one of his fights. I think it was his second fight for 247, and made his pro debut on the PFL Challenger Series. Did lose via knockout, but just to get that opportunity in your pro debut means that there's some people looking at you that have very high expectations, and I think this is a really interesting test. Two big, tall heavyweights, both 6'6", both going to be probably cutting weight to make heavyweight, and both
They're
super
giants.
athletic. Kinzik played football at Ohio State. I know Kovacs has a long wrestling background, and two guys that are kind of that next level of heavyweight, that next tier, and both I think Kinzik just turned 30 or 31, but like heavyweights fight forever, and these
Yep.
guys are both pretty young for heavyweights. So these are guys that you could see, I think, fighting on that Contender Series or fighting in the UFC sooner rather than later.
Absolutely. I think when you look at this card and you say, okay, which guys are, you know, the highest contenders to get to that next level, this is the fight I look at as well because a lot of reasons you said heavyweight is a much thinner division in general than other divisions too. So I think the path to making it to that level as a heavyweight, even look at the UFC heavyweight division, you know, they're obviously super elite athletes and everything, but it's clearly one of the most shallow divisions that the UFC has. It's just men aren't that large. These are giant men. So typically, you know, the average athletic male is more in that 155 to 185 range. That's just how it works out. But 6'6", 265, like you said, both of these guys are just absolute giants. And Raiden, you know, PFL debut, like you said, didn't go his way, but getting that opportunity says a lot. You know, PFL isn't just throwing people in there willy-nilly to get shine or get an opportunity. So Raiden absolutely earned that. And Cam Kinzig is actually a guy that I've heard about for a very long time from his coaches, from people close to him, as like, keep an eye on this guy because he's probably the next big thing. He's probably the next heavyweight to come out. He moves different. He hits different. I'm telling you, this guy's different. Now this sounds very intimidating, right? If you're Raiden's team and you're like, oh, wow, they've been hyping this guy up. He's been knocking everybody out. But I will tell you from working with Raid and his team, they've wanted this Cam Kinzig fight for a very long time. Even as an amateur, they've wanted
Wow.
this fight. So they
Yeah.
see something. They see something with him, and I genuinely don't know what it is. I don't know what they think they can exploit. But all I can say is that they do think there's something for Raiden to exploit, and they think this is a very good matchup. We sent the contract for this bout, and they signed it in 4 seconds, man. Like, they
Wow.
were so ready to go for this one and so hyped for this one. So I know they're ready. I know they're bringing their best, and it just makes me that much more excited for it because, like you said, you look on paper 3-0 versus 0-1. Okay, clearly the 3-0 guy's a huge favorite, but is he? I don't know, man, because Raiden's team clearly sees something, so I think that's
Yeah.
super interesting.
That's interesting. I'm curious to see what they think they can exploit. But yeah, again, Kinzig is another guy. You look at 3-0, 3-0, and by itself is impressive. But then the guys he's fought, like Jacob Hevlin, was his pro debut. Jacob's now 4-3 as a pro, and went on a tear after losing to Kinzig. He beat Matt Adams, who was a state champ wrestler, and Matt has has come in and he's about to make his LFA debut. And then he beat Aaron Bush on LFA, who was 5-1. And if you look back, going back to his amateur career, he also beat Dylan Budka, who just signed with the UFC
Yep.
last night. So the
Yep.
speaking of Dylan Budka, his teammate Mateo Garner, and this is I thought was interesting, going up to heavyweight from 185
Crazy.
to fight Quentin Campbell, and it's he said, "Hey, my teammate just anything you can do, I can do better." Right? My teammate just did
Mhm.
it. Dylan Budka did it like 2 weeks ago. And that's all they could talk about on that contender series fight last night was like he took a heavyweight fight 2 weeks ago and this dude's crazy and was outweighed by 40 pounds against this, huge jack dude.
Yeah.
And yeah, and then Mateo's coming in, made his pro debut at LFA, beat Trent Knott, who was 2-0, and fighting a guy who was again probably going to be cutting weight or pretty close to it to make heavyweight. And that's a really interesting fight. I don't know how that's going to go. I feel like Mateo probably has a little bit better known, and especially now being the LFA vet. But then Quentin went all the way out to Colorado for his pro debut, and won via a first round TKO. And he's coming in. He's the local guy training with Drive, and Scott
Mhm.
Wegman. Got to give Scott a shout out. Scott's an
Scott's the
old
man.
school Cincinnati guy, but training with Drive, and that's that's one I have no idea how it's going to go.
I'm
That's
right with
such
you.
an interesting
And
fight.
dude, I just want to back up for a second too and give Dylan Budka all the shine in the world because I think I know we have been tracking his career for a very long time. And for any young fighter out there, go follow Dylan on social media and follow what he's doing and watch how he's handled his career. He literally has followed, if I, being in this promotion game for 2 years now, I've seen it happen. I've watched fighters grow, I've watched fighters fall off the map. I've seen kind of all different levels of career at this point and how they can develop. If I was planning a blueprint for a fighter, if I was your manager, what I would tell you to do would be extremely similar to what Dylan Budka did. This guy was crazy active.
Yeah.
He took fights all the time, constantly fighting.
Anyway,
Winner, yep, any weight, win or lose, he would still get more popular off the fight because he talked so much about it, promoted it so much, made
yeah,
himself so known. And that's why he was so appealing for promotions. I mean, he fought for LFA, obviously, before the UFC, just won on Contender Series. And admittedly, Dana White even, admitted it wasn't the most fun fight that he's ever seen in his life. But Dylan still got a contract. And don't think for 1 second that the reason he still got a contract is that the UFC has been following him on social media. They see how
yeah,
he handles himself, how he promotes himself. They know that there's something they can work with there, and they see something in him, a future with him. And yeah, all the shine in the world to Dylan and how he's handled his career and how Demolition has helped him kind of build his career, man. He followed it to a T and now is in the UFC. So I'm sure Mateo's looking at that and planning a very similar path. I mean, you said it yourself, going up from middleweight to heavyweight. That's a total Dylan Budka move right there. So it makes
yeah,
perfect sense that he would be doing that. And I'm glad you said it too. Quentin, giant heavyweight. He's fought at super heavyweight before. Like, this is not just your average heavyweight. This is a very, very large man. And for Mateo specifically, with a very wrestling, grappling focused approach, makes that a very dangerous fight, in my opinion, because you would think, okay, he thinks he's a lot faster, can maybe stay out of range, piece him up on the feet. a wrestling and grappling strength advantage kind of goes out the window a little bit when you're giving up 50 plus pounds. I mean, we say it all the time, jiu-jitsu is the great equalizer. Smaller man can always win. But when both people are well trained and they know what they're doing, 50 pounds absolutely makes a difference. Anybody who tells you differently is
Yeah.
just out of their minds. Like Mateo's going to be, if he does take a wrestling heavy approach, even if he wins the exchanges, he's carrying around a lot of weight the whole time. See how his gas tank holds up, see how his muscles hold up. That's a super fun matchup, though, man. Like you said, Mateo could be the next guy as well. I mean, he has a teammate who's now in the UFC and a very, very good team around him with Demolition. Mateo's always handled his career well. I feel like I don't know if they discuss it. I don't know if him and Dylan specifically discuss this or they do something to Demolition, but those guys always seem to do the right things on social media and generate some buzz and be just enough controversial without crossing the line that they can generate that buzz and interest.
Yeah.
Dylan's one of those guys where if you're not on his side, I can see how he's very hateable, right? And that's great. That's a good thing. That's a super positive thing because we always say you either want people to love you or hate you. The worst thing they can do is not care about you.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
Dylan's presence is you can't not care about him. You got to either love or hate that guy. So perfect. Like I said, how he set up his career is awesome. And Mateo is definitely on a similar road, similar path. So super excited for that fight, man. All four of the pro fights on this
Yeah.
card are just nuts. For us, I think this is definitely one of our strongest, if not the strongest pro card we've ever put together.
Yeah, and of course, the pros are going to headline, but one of the things that I've done a lot of shows, I've been to a lot of shows. When you see these smaller amateur cards, I think you tend to get like those guys that are hungry that want to prove themselves. Like, hey, it's going to be a little bit easier to stand out. Give me like a name or two of someone that you think is going to like wow the crowd, where it's going to get the crowd on the feet, or whether it's a great fight, great fighter. Just like one or two names for people to watch out for.
For sure. There's a matchup on this card that's actually two guys who have fought for us before in Pittsburgh. So we're very familiar with them. And that's Cliff Richards versus Tim Von Biedenfeld, Timbo Slice. And Timbo Slice has fought for us twice. And both fights were like fight of the night contenders, if not the fight of the night. This guy is like literally all action all the time. I would highly recommend anybody go watch Tim Von Biedenfeld versus Colton Musgrove. It was Timbo Slice's debut. It's on 247 Live, our streaming app that has all of our past fight
And you
library
get to
on it
hear
as
me. I
well.
called that fight.
Nice. I forgot that you did call that. That's awesome.
Yeah.
And so I'm sure you remember Timbo was just eating bombs from Cole and like
Yeah.
smiling the entire time, just eating them with a smile. This dude is like, when you talk about a straight dog, he's like the Justin Gaethje of 247 FC. Like when we book Timbo Slice, we know it doesn't matter. Kill or be killed. This dude's going out there to put on a show. And Cliff fought for us once as well. And exact same mentality, just a total dog, very well trained with personal training tactics and Don Caker and that team. So that fight in particular, I'm obviously biased because they fought for us before, so I know them a lot better. But that's one that I look at and I'm like, yeah, this is absolutely can't miss amateur scrap.
Yeah, I want to see that. Of course, I think is going to be a great fight. But I want to see Vernell Hawkins, and I watched his fight, his debut. He's a really polished wrestler, high level college guy. Started out at community college, went to Mount St. Joe's here, right down the street, and now training under at Vision. And that's a gym that can really mold a guy. That can, hey,
Mm-hmm.
you come in as a pure wrestler, we can mold you. I'm excited to see his growth from fight one, which was just a couple months ago. I think it was like 4 months ago, to fight two against another wrestler, and see if he maybe isn't using the wrestling as much in this fight, because he fought a guy who was, I think, from Mexico originally in his first fight as an amateur, and fighting a wrestler. I want to see if he maybe changes it up, shows a little bit more in his
Yeah.
second fight. But fantastic fight card. Gonna be an awesome night of fights here on Saturday night at Sharonville Convention Center. I know you and I both share a love for MMA, but we also share a love for beer, craft beer. And I feel like you specifically picked Sharonville Convention Center because right across the street is probably one of the best breweries in Cincinnati, and Third Eye Brewing. So I know that we'll probably share a couple beers this weekend, and I'm excited to have you guys come to Cincinnati. See, hopefully Cincinnati shows out for the fight card. I think either way, it's gonna be a great night of fights. And yeah, tell people how they can get tickets, how they can watch it, all that fun stuff.
For sure, man, and great point. I won't say that Third Eye Brewing didn't have something to do with it. I was very I was very excited to see that right across the street, of course, and I do look forward to having a couple beers with you, man. You guys can all get tickets at 247fighting.com. Our ticketing widget is right on our homepage, so 247fighting.com, and you'll see it. Just click 513 Fight Night, get your tickets there. To watch it online, we do live stream all of our events. We have our own live streaming app called 247 Live, and it's also available on the web, stream247live.com. So you can get the pay per view there. And when you buy tickets, I highly urge you to choose a fighter as well that you're supporting, because they make commission on their ticket sales. This really helps these guys put some money in their pockets. It's a thankless job at times, especially for amateurs who are literally not getting fight purses, who cannot get fight purses. So for them, their income is almost wholly based on sponsors and ticket sales. So for amateurs, it's very important that they get the credit for their sales. So choose your fighter. You can do that for the pay-per-view as well. You can write in the name of the fighter you're supporting. So support your local fighters, guys. I know, like we started the show, Cincinnati MMA has been gone for a long time. There's been absolutely no scene here for the past 9 years. So we're hoping to restart something here, kickstart something, get the fire back. We got, like you said, Drive MMA, Vision, Immortals helping out, Demolition's coming in to help out. There are gyms here and fighters willing to do it. So let's do this thing, man. 247fighting.com, get those tickets, and we'll see you all there.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Hunter. Like I said, I'm excited for the fights this weekend. I'm excited to get back in the booth. It's been a while since I've done a show. Actually, I think like 2 or 3 months. So I'm itching to dust off the mic and get out there. I always have fun at 247 shows. The other thing too, uh, the thing that I love about 247 is you guys aren't just there to put on a fight card. It is a show, as a whole
Yeah.
show. And it's not just fights, which of course the fights are important, but the show is sometimes almost and production is like, hey, like this is a real show. Like I go there, I feel like I got my money's worth, not just from the fights, but I'm entertained in between the fights. And yeah, so get off to Sharonville Convention Center on Saturday night. The Buckeyes are playing early at noon, and it's Youngstown State. So, but also
Yep.
there's the other fun thing is Cincinnati and Pitt are playing this weekend in football, college football.
I know.
So
I noticed that. That's kind of
a little
hilarious.
bit of a
Yeah.
rivalry. It's in
I love
Pittsburgh,
that.
but so if you're in Cincinnati, you're not going to. Why would you go to Pittsburgh if you're in Cincinnati?
Don't do that. Yeah.
This is
Don't
gonna
do
be a
that.
fun football season. But fights on Saturday, and thank you so much, Hunter, for joining me. And yeah, get out to 247 on Saturday night.
Thanks, brother. I really
Yep.
appreciate it, man. Can't wait to see you Saturday.
All right.